So I want to talk about the origins of a Palestinian identity. And I do mean Palestinian identity, not Palestinian nationalism, because I think the problem with studying Palestinian nationalism is that nobody can agree about what nationalism is. The conventional wisdom was that the French Revolution inspired an era of nationalism, but then historians got clever, and one historian was like, yo, I found nationalism not in 17th century France, but in 16th century France. And then another said, I found it in the 16th century, but in the Arab world. And then another said, oh yeah, well, I found it in the 14th century in North Africa. And then the 13th century Greece, and then medieval Netherlands, and then in the 8th century and the 11th century among the Anglo-Saxons and the Irish. And then someone else found nationalism in the 7th century in Tang Dynasty China, and then the 5th century among the Byzantines and the ancient Athenians, Hebrews, Moabites, Edomites, and Assyrians. And so I think trying to write about nationalism is just a little bit like walking through a field of landmines, and I don't really have any interest in doing that. So I'm going to focus my talk today on not on nationalism, but on the origins of a Palestinian identity. And so let me just be more specific about what I mean here when I say Palestinian identity. I think at its core, a Palestinian identity is an identity based on or based around Palestine. That is to say that it's a place-based identity. And I think that differentiates Palestinian identity from religious identities, because religions are not places. And so let's call this the where are you from test. If I ask you, where are you from? You're not going to say Judaism. It doesn't work. So Judaism is not a place-based identity. I think this also differentiates a Palestinian identity from racial identities. It's like, where are you from? I'm from white. Okay, so that doesn't work either. And so I think place-based identities have to pass the where are you from test. So a Palestinian identity is a place-based identity because Palestine is a place, but I think we can be more precise than that. Palestine is a massive place. It's let's call it a region, a land, a territory. In fact, I think it's so massive that before the 19th century, few people had ever even seen Palestine. And that's because you need a map to see it. And maps were not in widespread circulation until, let's say, the 19th and 20th centuries. And so I think this also differentiates Palestine from many other places, like villages and cities, or like mountains or rivers. We can wrap our head around these kinds of places much easier than we can wrap our head around Palestine, because we're able to see these places, villages, cities, mountains, rivers. We're able to see them with our own two eyes. And so I think Palestine is a much harder place to believe in and to imagine, and therefore to identify with. It's just much harder to wrap your head around this abstract idea. And so I think what we've done now is establish what a Palestinian identity is. It is an identity based around a land or a region. And so I want to talk briefly about when such an identity comes about in history. And I'm going to focus on two periods, the 10th century and the 19th century, because I was told this conference is all about looking at the longue durée and looking at the sort of, let's say, pre-19th century origins of the Israel-Palestine issue. So I thought I could add more of a longer view on the origins, let's say, and development of a Palestinian identity. And so let's start with the 10th century. So we're talking 1,000 years ago. You have a guy named Muhammad bin Ahmed Al-Makhti, also known as Al-Muqaddisi. He dies in 991. And interestingly enough, he identifies himself as a Palestinian in a work he wrote called Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Ma'rifat al-Aqalim. It's probably one of, if not the most renowned geographical treatise in the entire, let's say, maybe not the entire Islamic era, but certainly in the early Islamic period. This is one of the most renowned works, one of the most renowned geographical treatises. And Al-Makhti, he travels around the Muslim world, and he visits Iran, and he relays an exchange that he had with a construction worker in the city of Shiraz, Iran. And he tells this worker that he would have an easier time chiseling a hole in the stone if this worker were to use a wedge. And so Al-Makhti says, I told him about construction in Palestine. And this Shirazi stonecutter asks, are you Egyptian? And Al-Makhti says, no, I am Palestinian. And then Al-Makhti also writes that he was called 36 different names while traveling, one of which was Palestinian. And so the first question I think here is why does Al-Makhti define himself as Palestinian, and why do other people identify him as Palestinian as well? And so a few things, a few noteworthy points I would make here. The first is that during Al-Makhti's era, so we're talking second half of the 10th century, the word Palestine is in more or less continual usage for many, many centuries, both at the political level, as well as the day-to-day conversational level. That's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that Al-Makhti was born and raised in the heartland of that Palestine. He's born and raised in Jerusalem. And Al-Makhti is also one of the most well-traveled Muslims of his entire area. And I think travelers tend to be a little bit more inclined to think in larger units of space, being these people traveling around, visiting lots of regions, lots of countries, lots of empires. They have an ability, I think, to grasp and to imagine these larger units of space. Point number 4 I would make is that the field of geography, geographical studies in the Islamic world has really reached its zenith in popularity during Al-Makhti's era. And so I think in a world where geography is popular and in a world where, and remember, geography is the study of physical places. So I don't think it's a surprise to see people then identifying with those places, especially the people becoming experts in writing about physical geography and places. And the final point I would make is Al-Makhti was highly educated. He uses rhythmic prose and poetry. And so I think place-based identities being more intangible, more abstract, more difficult to visualize, they require more education. And so for all these reasons, I don't think it's that surprising to see someone like Al-Makhti identify himself as a Palestinian. Having said that, this is a sample size of 1, okay? I'm not going to come here and tell you that in the 10th century, we have 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 people calling themselves Palestinians. No, there's one source. History has not always been so kind to historians, but and so we have to try to extrapolate based on the very little historical evidence we have. But we do also have some hadith transmitters in the early Islamic period that are identified as being from Palestine, Philistini, and so that there are a few, not so many, but there are a few. And so what I would like to do now is before going to the second example, the late 19th and early 20th century, when, say, the modern Palestinian identity emerges, I just want to briefly talk about what happens in the intervening 900 years. And so Al-Makhti identifies himself as Palestinian in the 10th century, but then this identity seemingly falls out of use for, say, 900 years. And so the question is, what happens? And the first thing I would point out is that Palestine falls out of administrative use, right? As opposed to the early Islamic states, the Umayyads, who include Palestine or Jund Philistine in their divisions within the Muslim Empire. This is not the case with the Crusaders, who the first crusade, I think, is late 11th century. And so during the Crusader period, as well as the Ayyubid period, Salah ad-Din does not use the term Palestine in his administrative parlance, neither do the Mamluks or the Ottomans. And so the word falls out of administrative use, and this is definitely a buzzkill for Palestine, because states play a critical role in understanding the rise and fall of places and of place names, and thus also of identities based on places. That's the first thing I would point out. The second point I would make is that Palestine does nevertheless persist. And this is very important in understanding why it reemerges in the 19th century. And the reason Palestine persists as a name used by people to describe this region is because, remember, from the 10th century to the 19th century, Muslims and Christians continue to copy, collate, and analyze the earlier texts of their traditions, which were written during a time when Palestine was in fact in use. And so for the same reason that all of us today can talk about Mesopotamia or Phoenicia as places that used to exist, even though if we were to visit Lebanon or visit Iraq, we would not call them Mesopotamia or Phoenicia. For the same reason, Arabs and Muslims and Christians and writers in the 13th and 15th and 18th centuries also wrote about Palestine. You can just go check the Wikipedia page called The Timeline of the Name Palestine, and you can probably just like peace out now, because you're going to learn a lot more from that wiki page than you are listening to me. So, but the second point I would make is that Palestine persists because it survives as the name of the region, of the territory in the city of Ramla. And I think, and there's a number of sources. I could rattle off probably a half dozen sources from the 13th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries of people who were born and raised in the city of Ramla, not to be confused with Ramallah. This is Ramla. So halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Jaffa. And so people from the city, they call the place Palestine at a time when people from Akka or Nablus are not calling the place Palestine. And I think that's because Ramla was the capital of the District of Palestine in the early Islamic period for many, many centuries. It was also the geographical center of this administrative territorial unit, as well as the economic hub. It was it was on the road connecting Damascus and Cairo, and it was actually one of the main trading hubs connecting those two big important cities. And so it serves as this important economic hub. It's a fertile region, and so you have a hinterland. It was a geographic center as well as politically important in the early Islamic period. And so people from that city, I think, remember the name and continue to use it more or less continuously over the course of the 900 years from the 10th century to the 19th century. And so that brings us to the 19th century. And so we have the reemergence of a Palestinian identity in the 19th century, and a bit of context for what is going on around this time to make sense of why a Palestinian identity reemerges. You had Europeans and Americans flocking to Palestine in the 19th century as consular officials, as missionaries, as pilgrims, and these foreigners bring with them lots of foreign words. I mean, they're foreign words, they're also Arabic words. So they're using the word Palestine in their day-to-day speech. They're using the word Palestine on maps that they print and they distribute, in the schools that they open. Remember, there are hundreds of missionary schools opening up in the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 19th century. And we're talking German schools, American, French, British, Russian. All of these schools are opening up and they're using textbooks. They're in those schools, they are teaching with books called The Geography of Palestine and The History of Palestine, and they're using with maps called A Map of Palestine. And in fact, I found 4 instances from 1870 to 1898 of the word Palestinian being used in English, German, and Russian to describe the native Arabic-speaking inhabitants of the land of Palestine. And so lo and behold, beginning in 1898, you have the first guy is Khalil Bedas. He translates a book called A Description of the Holy Land from Russian to Arabic. He goes to one of these missionary schools, the Russian Teachers Training Seminary in Nazareth, and he starts using the word Palestinian. You have others like Salim Kobain and Najib Nassar who also start using the term Palestinian in their writings. I've written about these in a number of pieces I've published in the past a couple of years. And so I think what you have is that, with the word Palestinian coming back into the Middle East from Europe, from the US, and it already being a word that is an Arabic word that resonates with local Arabic speakers, you have this fusion of cultures and languages. And so the word Palestinian reemerges and people start to call themselves Palestinian beginning in the 20th century. And so just to summarize, I would like to end just with maybe some more conceptual conceptual observations on sort of when and why place-based identities come about in history. In other words, if we had to abstract away Palestine and just ask ourselves, why do place-based identities come about in history? What would I say? I would say that they come about when the place is itself a state, or it's a unit within a state, or it's used by state actors like soldiers or diplomats or missionaries. States play such a critical role in so many things, including when and why places come about and places get used and become the everyday word that people use to describe a region or a territory or a land. So states are critical. And then the last point, the final point I would make here is that I think because places are such abstract ideas, especially these big ones, these big territories, they need things like history books and geography books and maps and institutions and organizations to make those big abstract places seem real to people. And so I think when you get histories of and geographies and maps of Palestine, and you get organizations and institutions based on Palestine or around Palestine or dedicated to the study of Palestine, you're much more likely to see identities based on Palestine come about and flourish and prosper. And with that, I'll end my talk, and happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. That was very, very interesting, especially considering that at Hill we have actually been doing a whole module covering Palestine and national identity and stuff. So that was very, very useful. Thank you. I will take some questions from the question and answer box, but we haven't got any right now. So I will give people a couple of minutes to type some in. You can also, if you're a part of the panel, panelists or hosts, you can also private message me for a question. Sorry, I'll just give them a minute to be typed out. We have here from Karen Lovey. Sorry if I said it wrong. You say that Palestine is a big territory. How big? What's its general borders?
So I would say that Palestine is defined differently in different time periods by different people in different places. I think I would identify something like 4 or 5 different images of Palestine that people have in history. So I think the most classic definition, let's call it the classic Muslim definition of Palestine that you see repeated in many classic works, in many classic geographies and histories written over the past 1200 years. You have a 4-point coordinate. Palestine is described as a region extending from Rafah in the south, whereas today Gaza, all the way up to Lajun in the north. And the east-west coordinates are usually described as from Jericho to Jaffa or from Jericho to the Dead Sea. And those are that definition I've seen probably a dozen times over the course of various Islamic works, Arabic works over the past 1,000 years. You have a second definition, which is just the coastal plains, not the mountainous interior. So if you look at Palestine's physical geography, you have the coastal plains, Jaffa, Gaza, Ramle, Lod. Then you have the mountainous interior, Hebron, Jerusalem, Nablus, Jenin. So many writers, because they have, you find this definition in some early modern European writers, because they have the biblical image of Pleshet, the Plishtim, the Philistines living on the coastal plains. So they think that's Palestine. And so in the early 18th century, you have some European writers saying Palestine is just like Gaza, Jaffa, and Ramle, but not Jerusalem or Nablus or Hebron. That's the second definition. The third definition, you see some people using the word Palestine interchangeably with the city of Ramle. If you're curious to learn more about that history, I wrote a 15,000 word paper just digging up sources and writers who use those two terms interchangeably. So that it's a minority view in Islamic history, but there are a lot of writers who seem to think Palestine is not a region, but it's actually a city. There's a fourth view, which is that Palestine and the Holy Land are interchangeable. And let's say there's a fifth view that conflates the district of Jerusalem, that 1872 district the Ottomans create. They carve out this administrative district, the Mutasarriflik of Jerusalem, and many writers see that as synonymous with Palestine. That only extends, I think, as far north. It's like a line between Jerusalem and Nablus. So that, and then it extends down to the southern desert, and that's sort of an amorphous, ill-defined border in the south. So you see a lot of different definitions of Palestine in history. And of course, there is no correct or incorrect definition. There's no canonical definition. People talk about the British mandate Palestine as historic Palestine. It's not really clear to me why the 26 years between 1922 and 1948 are historic Palestine, whereas the 26 years before that or after that are not historic, and in fact they're not really relevant for most people. But that's just how things have turned out.
Thank you. We have a comment from Dr. James Renton. It's really refreshing to me that you have written a big history of your subject. And a question: do you get frustrated by historians of Palestine focusing so much on the 19th and 20th centuries?
Well, if I was frustrated historians for focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries, I would first and foremost have to be frustrated with myself, because I am, although I may be pretending to know something about the pre-19th century Arab Middle East, that is certainly not my area of specialization and focus. Most of the work I've done is also on the 19th and 20th centuries. And look, I don't think there's a reason we should be bothered by this. I think, first of all, the 19th and 20th century sources are much more accessible. Okay, if you want to go study the 18th century Palestine, like good luck trying to understand the Jerusalem Sharia court records of the 18th century. They're just extremely difficult to understand. The handwriting is difficult. You got to go to like the Sharia court records in Jerusalem, which is open like 2 hours a week. I'm making that up. I don't know, but they're not accessible. You can't find them online. They're not digitized. They're difficult to access. The same is true of the Ottoman sources, calligraphy, very difficult to read and understand. You have European travel accounts from, let's say, the 18th, 17th centuries. You have Arabic and Ottoman travel accounts from the 18th and 17th centuries. But again, if you want to really access the original sources, like pre-19th century Middle East is just much harder to study. So I don't blame people for not focusing on those time periods. Having said that, yeah, I think it's a great point. I do wish more scholars focused on kind of bigger picture stuff on pre-19th century stuff, because it's a fascinating period that there hasn't been enough written about.
Thank you. And there is a follow-up question, a counterfactual. What if there is Renaissance hadn't happened? And on that note, can you please outline your theoretical understanding of how European, Palestinian, Christian, including Middle Eastern, Muslim and Jewish conceptions of the land intermingle and influence each other?
Got it. Okay, so counterfactual. What if the Renaissance hadn't happened? Well, are we referring to here to the European Renaissance or the Arab Renaissance? Can the questioner clarify? Are we talking the Nahda, or are we talking like classical European Renaissance in like the 16th, 17th century European? Got it. Well, I think what happens in the, let's say, 16th, 17th century European Renaissance is that you have all of these Florentines and people in the Netherlands and people in the UK. It's not called the UK, obviously, but anyways, people are digging up these Latin and Greek texts, the Herodotus, the Ptolemies, all these classic works written in Greek and Latin, and they're translating them into modern European languages and publishing them. And those classic writers, those classic Greek and Latin writers, those people are using the word Palestine. And so I think that's part of the reason why Palestine gets revived in Europe. I think also just the general like return or interest in not just classical Latin and Greek writers, but also a return to the Bible itself and the language of the Bible, which includes, of course, the word the pleshet, plishtim. Remember European Renaissance writers, Martin Luther. You have the return to the original text. So you get all of this classical terminology revived. I think that's one of the reasons why Palestine gets revived in Europe, roughly, let's say, in the 17th, 17th, 18th centuries. Now, would that had Palestine not gotten revived in Europe, like what would have happened? Counterfactual is interesting and fun, but who knows? It's sort of hard to know. But to the second part of that question, can I outline my theoretical understanding of how European, Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish conceptions of the land intermingle? Wow, very, very, very interesting question. Well, I guess I would say that when I'm looking through sources, oftentimes I'll discover after the fact if a source is Jewish or Christian or Muslim, right? It's not like I know already. It's not like I kind of know before even going to the source necessarily what the religious affiliation or background of the writer is. And so I would kind of have to like look back and ask myself, okay, so Christian writers, Muslim writers, Jewish writers, how are they defining Palestine differently? Well, I would say that it's not always obvious they are. So let's take, for example, the Ramla equals Palestine conception. In other words, that Ramla is the city of Palestine and that Palestine is considered a city, not a region. So I found you have a Jewish writer in the 13th, 14th century, Ishtora Parthi. This is all on the Wikipedia page I reference. So, go check that out and you can live fact check this. But Ishtora Parthi, he's a Jewish writer. He's a traveler. He visits Palestine in, I think this is 12th or the 13th century. And he says, yeah, Palestine is the city of Ramla. The same is true of Muslim writers. And I think I even found a Christian writer. I have to double check the paper. But so, and anyways, it's crossing across religious boundaries. I think the Holy Land is another one that crosses religious boundaries. Jews, Christians, Muslims all talk about the Holy Land. And all, it's pretty clear that some Jews, some Christians, some Muslims all see the Holy Land as Palestine. There's even, I think, a couple of hadiths that say, because al-Ard al-Muqaddisa is a Quranic term, the Holy Land appears in the Quran. And so you get all these hadith commentators, all these Muslim commenters asking, what is that Holy Land referring to? And some Muslims are saying, oh, it's Palestine. And then I think Jews as well are thinking of maybe they don't necessarily call it Palestine, maybe they call it the land of Israel. Some of them are also calling it the land of Palestine, and they're also conflating it with the Holy Land. So yeah, just my hot take, just thinking about this kind of on the fly, it's not obvious to me that these groups are thinking of Palestine all that differently.
Thank you. I've got two questions in the Q&A box. I'll ask the second one just because the first one opens quite a lot of opinions on it. When the administrative usage of Palestine dies down, is there a rise in people identifying with the city, village, region, or even with the Ottoman Empire? How does this identification with one's locally interact with people seeing themselves as Palestinian? Example, is reference to oneself as a Jerusalemite?
I'm sorry, could you just, do you mind repeating the question? I apologize.
Yeah, sorry. When the administrative usage of Palestine dies down, is there a rise in people identifying with the city/village/region, or even with the Ottoman Empire? How does this identification with one's locality interact with people seeing themselves as Palestinians? Example, is reference to oneself as a Jerusalemite?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, let me just say these identities obviously coexist. You can believe you're a Palestinian at the same time that you can believe you're a Jerusalemite. There's no contradiction whatsoever. In fact, I think these identities tend to reinforce one another, because if you say you're a Jerusalemite, then the first sort of question when you go to Iran is, or if you go, let's just say you say you're from Nilain, and someone's like, and you go to Iran and someone's like, yo, where are you from? You're probably gonna say I'm from Palestine, not Nilain, because no one in Iran has heard of Nilain. Okay, so I think as soon as you sort of leave your immediate orbit of influence and meet people from other places, you tend to need to zoom out a little bit and talk not just about the cities and villages you're from, but also the bigger regions you're from, because those are more likely to be familiar to people from further and further away places. So I don't think they're in contradiction. I do think, however, that cities are much more important sources of identity for the vast majority of history in the vast majority of times and places, including Palestine. And that's because if I'm from Jerusalem in this 18th century, Jerusalem is surrounded by a wall. Okay. If you want to leave Jerusalem, you need to like pass through a gate, and there are guards. And so like you have an image of Jerusalem. You can go stand on the Mount of Olives and literally see the entire city of Jerusalem surrounded by a wall. So I think that makes Palestine more real. It makes it more tangible. You can see it with your own eyes. So I just think for all those reasons, it's just so much easier to identify with a thing that it is more tangible. You can touch the walls. You can literally meet many, if not a majority of the people in this city over the course of your lifetime, because it has however many thousands or 5, 10, 20,000 inhabitants. Like that's a manageable number of people. You can meet a lot of them. So it's just much more easy, I think, to wrap our heads around these smaller spaces than it is much bigger spaces. And so I think for that reason, they're much more important to most people in most times and places.
Thank you. The next question has been put anonymously. Have you looked at Noma Salah's Palestine, a 4,000-year history? If so, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I saw that he published that, and kudos to him. I have not actually read that book yet, and so I very much look forward to reading it. But it's it came out, I think, shortly after I published my dissertation, or not published, but finished my dissertation in 2017. But that book came out, it was just maybe a year or two ago, and I wish it had come out 5 years earlier so that I could have benefited from it in writing my own dissertation. But he had an article, I think. Is it Norma Salha? I think he had an article that came out that I believe I referenced, and but unfortunately I can't speak to it because I haven't read it yet.
Thank you. And the last question by Michael Bukowitz. Although beyond the time period, can you comment on Ben Gurion's controversial choice of Israel as the name of the state?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, because if you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, Jews in Palestine, the Jewish community, the Yishuv of Palestine, is using the word Palestine relatively uncontroversially. Okay, if you're a Ben Gurion in 1925 or 1935 or 1945, you're calling the place Palestine. Everyone's calling the place Palestine. That's the name of the state, the British mandate for Palestine, with one or two minor exceptions. So in the 1920s, the British mint coins, and they print the word Palestina in Hebrew letters on the coins, and this bothers some Zionists who lobby the British to change that to Eretz Israel. And the British strike this compromise in the classic British thing, which is try and make everyone happy and nobody happy at the same time, which is that we're going to put the words Aleph Yud in parentheses, which supposedly mean Eretz Israel, not supposedly, which refer to Eretz Israel, but they still keep the word Palestine. So it's Palestina and then Aleph Yud in parentheses. And so they're trying to make everyone happy. But so that's the first like inkling or a murmuring or a rumbling of this kind of controversy, let's say, over what this place should be called in Hebrew. But yeah, I think so that's the first point. And then you actually get another Zionist writer in the 1936, Michael Asaf, I believe is his name, writes a book called The Arab Movements in Palestine, in which he says that there was no such thing as Palestine. I think the book comes out in Hebrew, but it's translated into English and a lot of other languages. And he basically says, like, this place was never called Palestine. He's already trying to undermine the idea that the Arabs or Palestinians ever even use the word Palestine. And I think he calls it, I think maybe, yeah, I'm not actually sure what he calls it, but all of this is to say that, but those are exceptions. The controversy of the coins in the Michael Asaf 1936 book, those are exceptions. For the vast majority of people, Palestine is uncontroversial. However, Palestine is uncontroversial in English. But here's the thing: the Zionist community establishes Hebrew as the lingua franca of the community, and so Hebrew, being this dead language for so many years, is not absorbing words, new geographical terms that come that come into usage over the intervening, 2,500 years, or during this long period of time when the Hebrew